And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
I really appreciate the opportunity this week to have our guest Harriet Hageman on. Harriet is recently was one of our speakers at a presentation we did called the Red Pill Expo in Bozeman, Montana, and on June 23rd and 24th. And Harriet, you not only homered, you knocked it completely out of the park with your presentation there. Your program on federal regulation kind of set the standards for the expo from there on out, and I heard a lot of very positive comments, and I think that your opportunities are going to be enormous as a public speaker based on what I've seen so far. So anyway, with that said, I'd like to get started with tonight's show, talking about the number and percentage of new laws being created per year by unelected bureaucrats under the executive branch. And it's important that people understand this is not legislative law, this is executive law. And I'd like for you to kind of explain some of the ways that the executive branch is literally taking over the regulation and therefore the law in our country.
Well, Dan, thank you for having me on. I so appreciate this opportunity. I was visiting with Kelby before we started the program this evening and indicating that I have been on this program now twice before, once in December with the 5-minute program that you did, and then last summer you and I were able to visit about a variety of issues. I believe it was last July. Yes, I have been investigating and researching this regulatory issue for quite some time now. I believe that my first speech on this was in December of 2010. I've learned a lot more since then. I've done a lot more investigation into what is going on in our country, and there's a few things that I would start with. I believe that Thomas Jefferson and quotes that he provides is always a good way to start a discussion, simply because he was such a brilliant man and so capable of understanding what government is and should be and should not be. He stated that the two enemies of the people are criminals and government, so let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so that the second will not become the legalized version of the first. And I think that that's really an important quote or an important statement in terms of what our government is supposed to be. We are a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. We are a Republican form of government, meaning we are a representative form of government. We have the three branches of government. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, and it's only in the legislative branch that they should be making any laws. Yet since the 1930s, that has changed over time, and we are now to the point where the true lawmakers in this country are not our representatives, our congressmen and women, our senators, either at the state or federal level. What we have found is that the real governing class is now the executive branch, and they are the nameless, faceless bureaucrats that run and work in these various agencies. The agencies include the Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm predominantly going to focus tonight on the federal agencies because that's what I do, and I truly believe that most of the power in this country ought to reside with the states. And so while there are regulatory issues in the states, I think that the real crime of what's happening here and what is happening in terms of the unconstitutionality of these federal regulatory agencies is exacerbated because they are coming from on high. They are coming from Washington, D.C. They are not being debated and addressed here in our states. And so I think that it has even more of a negative impact in terms of what our country really is, the framework of our country, what we're supposed to be. So just to give you some numbers, in 2009, Congress passed 125 bills, but there were over 3,500 regulations adopted by the federal agencies in that 1 year. In 2010, Congress passed 217 bills, and the executive branch agencies adopted 3,573 regulations. Skipping over a couple more years, in 2013, Congress passed only 72 new laws, yet there were 3,659 new regulations that were adopted. That's 51 regulations for every law, and it also represents a new rule every 2.5 hours. In 2014, Congress passed 296 new laws, but there were 3,541 new regulations. By the end of 2014, the Obama administration had pushed through over 21,000 regulations. Keep in mind, every one of those regulations have the force and effect of law. So whether they are adopted or imposed through the regulatory regime or they adopted by Congress, they essentially are equal in terms of their power and in terms of their enforceability against the citizens of this country. In 2016, obviously the most recent year for which I have data, Congress passed 214 laws, and there were 3,853 new regulations, which represented a ratio of 18-1. This information comes from the Competitive Enterprise Institute as well as other sources, but what this tells you is that the governing class, or our representative form of government, has been taken over by regulators and taken over by people that you and I have. Not only do we not know who they are, we have no ability to fire them. We have no ability to say, no, we disagree with that regulation, and we're going to unseat you next time. If you adopt that regulation, you're going to lose your seat in Congress. And you can see the significance and the import of that when you look at what happened with Obamacare. Since President Obama was elected in 2008, you can look at the absolute crushing defeat that his party took starting in 2010, going on to 2012, 14, and 16. And the Democrats have lost at the state level. They've lost at the federal level. They've lost in the governorships. They've lost across the board. And they have because people don't like the policies that he pushed through, and that a democratically controlled Senate and House pushed through, most predominantly, I guess I would say, the Dodd-Frank as well as Obamacare. And as a result, we unseated him. We got rid of him. We fired him. We said, you were here to represent us, and you didn't. And that is not only in Wyoming, although we didn't have a Democrat congressional delegation anyway, but in other states. They replaced a lot of those Democrats with a lot of Republicans. And the people did it because they said we're a republic, and what you did was wrong, and we disagreed with it, and you're fired. We don't get to do that with these executive agencies. So when they adopt a draconian rule that may have an impact on our economy of $19.1 billion or $23.6 billion or $750 billion or $397 million, we don't get to look at them and say, you're gone, you're out, you're done, it's over. You can look at the VA. It's a disaster. The people who protect us are not subject to any kind of repercussion if they do bad things. And that is where we have created what I believe is a very unconstitutional construct, if you will, by giving this kind of power to these agencies.
I agree. And they really, very literally, are the fourth branch of government, and they have become far and away the strongest and the most controlling branch of government. In fact, they're completely uncontrollable, as you say. I found it interesting that the EPA was formed under Nixon, under President Nixon, a so-called conservative president, and it was done by executive order. Now, the EPA is absolutely wrecking havoc in our country, and it has done more to hurt rural America than any other agency in the government, and yet it was an executive order by a president that turned that agency into the nightmare that it is. That's just phenomenal that we can see that kind of thing happen by executive order. But that's exactly the danger that we see with executive orders. Harriet, is there a dollar number that you can attribute to regulatory burdens on American taxpayers per year? Is there a number that you can kind of shoot out here for our listeners?
I sure can, and there's a couple of things to think about. And before we get specifically to that number, I would like to point out that just as of when I was up in Bozeman at the Red Pill Expo, our federal government debt was $19,950,533,000,000 as of the 20th of June 2017. In March, it was $19.8 trillion. You can see how rapidly the debt has gone up. In August of 2013, about 4 years ago, it was $16.9 trillion. It has gone up over $3 trillion in less than 4 years. And I say that only because a lot of the debt that is being incurred is because we are supporting agencies and we are supporting a regulatory regime that is completely out of control. When I give you these numbers and they're shocking, keep in mind that these are off-the-book numbers. So we know, or we have an idea, or we should have an idea that we're at $20 trillion in terms of debt in this country. We're either going to have to inflate our way out of it or we're going to default. I think you would have people tell you now that it's actuarially impossible to pay that back. That $20 trillion is not only really bad in and of itself, that it has been used, or deficit spending has been used for decades now to cover up a lot of really bad policy. Mm-hmm. The bad policy is coming out of these agencies. And just to give you an example, not long ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service commissioned a study and paid for a study to evaluate shrimp on treadmills. I personally
I'd like to see how they do that.
Well, and I find that astounding that when we're talking about a $20 trillion debt, why would we have a federal agency paying people to do studies that are shrimp on treadmills? More recently, they've done a study of fish on treadmills. So these are the kinds of things that our agencies are paying for, spending money on, and as a result, we have a $20 trillion debt. But that's a debt that we have on the books that you can say that at some point we're going to have to address. But that debt has covered up a lot of really bad policy coming out of Washington, D.C., and I can give you many, many, many more examples of that. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the regulatory cost, which is almost off-the-books debt that we're paying for in this country, in 1992, the regulatory cost in this country was $400 billion. That was 25 years ago. In 1992, that was 25 years ago, it was $400 billion. As of 2008, it was $1.75 trillion. That is the regulatory burden as of 2008. That doesn't include Obamacare. It doesn't include Dodd-Frank. It doesn't include the EPA regulations, which are some of the most costly in U.S. history. As of 2015, I didn't have one with the data I have in front of me. I didn't have the 2016 data tallied yet. According to, again, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, it is $1.948 trillion. That is the cost of the regulatory burden of this country in this country. What does that mean? I can talk about that until the cows come home and people think, yeah, okay, those numbers are so astounding. What do they even mean? Well, what they mean is that's a tax, a hidden tax or cost against all of us that at average is about $15,000 of additional costs per year per household. So there, while we know what our income tax burden is and we can get some idea of sales tax and that sort of thing, what people don't understand is they're paying about $15,000 a year more than they would be without this regulatory burden. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. In Wyoming, in order to get a gravel permit on private land, to get a regular gravel mining permit for a regular gravel operation, we're digging dirt. Gravel is one of the most basic resources that we have to have to survive in our society, in order to build roads, build buildings, any of those things, it can be upwards of $300,000 just to do the land quality permit application to submit to get the permit. Well, those gravel companies don't eat $300,000. They pass it on to us.
Sure.
So every road is more expensive. Every building is more expensive. Everything that we do is exponentially more expensive because there are these regulations on everything that we do as individuals and as citizens. So that economic cost is coming out of our pockets, but we aren't even told that it exists. We aren't even informed of what the impact is. In addition to which, these agencies, on average, there has been a study done, and the agencies are required to disclose the cost of a regulation if it exceeds $100 million. Well, think about that. Who came up with that silly rule? Why would these agencies not have to disclose the cost of a regulation if it's going to have an impact of less than $100 million? I mean, $100 million, for goodness sakes, is an awful lot of money. But they basically, there's no oversight of them up to $100 million, but you may be surprised by this. The statistics demonstrate that they typically underestimate the cost of their regulations by 40%. So for every regulation that we hear that is going to be $100 million, we know it's 140. For every $1 billion regulations, it's $1 billion regulation, it's $1.4 billion. That's, again, what these agencies are doing. They're not even held accountable to be within 40% of the cost of the regulations that they are imposing against the citizens of this country.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. And the thing that I think most people don't realize, too, is what you're talking about is the debt that's on the books, the things that you see on the debt clock. But on top of that, we've got unfunded liabilities to the tune of about $128 trillion that are sitting there as well. And all I can say is that if people just realize that even though they keep adding this to our debt and it doesn't cost us anything today, that the day will come very, very shortly when all these debts come due, and it will completely wipe out our country.
Well, I will tell you, we had essentially a stagnant economy for the entirety of the Obama administration. And we can talk about all different kinds of things, the crash in 2008, which I think that we need to be looking a lot more closely at what the purpose of that entire situation was.
Right.
But I'll step away from that for a moment. But much of it lies in the fact that we're not only overly regulated, but the fact that we've created a government employee business model that actually encourages delay, increases the cost of doing business, incentivizes agencies to interpret all statutes in the most draconian way possible, and rewards those agencies who use penalties as a way of padding their own coffers. And I can give you an example of that. We again can talk about the debt, but what we have to understand is that we as a society cannot move forward. We are becoming risk averse because our agencies have become so draconian that they've become almost totalitarian governments in and of themselves. And Congress is to blame for part of this. Congress has the ability to take this power back. Our congressional representatives often don't want to take it back. They don't want to exercise their authority. They don't want to be held accountable for making difficult decisions. We're watching that play out right now. Right. But we have actually created a business model with the agencies that I work with that they are incentivized to impose regulations for their own benefit, not the benefit of the environment. I'm a water and natural resource attorney, and I have tried a lot of lawsuits in my career. I've been in private practice for the vast majority of my career, and I have fought against the federal government on numerous occasions, dealing with the Endangered Species Act and wolf management and the EPA and the Clean Water Act and those sorts of things. Not because I don't want to protect the environment and not because I don't want to protect wildlife, but these agencies' missions are no longer focused on that. these agencies' missions are empowering themselves. I refer to this as the California model. In California, approximately as much as 70% or more of their funding doesn't go to building highways, for example. It goes to paying employees. It goes to employee salaries. And that's exactly what's happening at the federal level. I tried a case several years ago where a gentleman moved an irrigation ditch on his own private property. According to the Corps of Engineers and EPA, it affected 2.1 acres of land, again, on his private property. Mm-hmm. They sued him for violating the Clean Water Act. We went to trial for 2 weeks, but at one point, because they are entitled to impose fines or penalties of $37,500 per day, and they wouldn't tell me what penalties they were seeking against him. So just doing the math and the amount of time it took us to try that case, at one point he was facing penalties of $65 million.
Oh, man. On 2.5 acres.
on private land, moving an irrigation ditch. We went to a 2-week trial. The entire case cost him $1 million. We won. We were able to demonstrate that he did not violate the Clean Water Act. But there were several significant things that happened in that case. One was that he dramatically improved the environment because this was a farm that had been really allowed to, to go to pot, if you will, and the erosion across it because of the water through this irrigation ditch had just become extreme. So he went in, he was an engineer, he spent $300,000 on the project, built a beautiful project to control that water. The EPA actually filed a motion in limine with the judge to prevent me from telling the jury about all of the environmental benefits of his project.
Wow.
And it was the biggest fight that we had was I was not allowed to describe all of the environmental benefits. There wasn't a downside, but I was not allowed to tell the jury of the environmental benefits. And in fact, I wasn't even allowed. The jury was never shown a photograph of the completed project because of how good it looked. I was not allowed to introduce evidence of the environmental benefits of this project and the wetlands that were created. So tell me, who was more interested in the environment, the EPA or me?
Well, and that gets in another issue that we'll discuss at the end of this, but that's the fact that we've got so many activist judges that are allowing this sort of crazy imbalance in our legal system to take place and allow these agencies carte blanche.
Well, and there are several reasons for that. One is that what you've said is absolutely true. These agencies have been given a lot of power by Congress, and so the judges themselves tend to defer to the agencies. There's a decision that came out in 1984, and this is one of the reasons why I was so pleased with the Justice Gorsuch nomination, because he recognizes and has written about the problems associated with what we refer to as the Chevron decision. And the Chevron decision essentially says that if there's any ambiguity in a statute, that the agency is the one that gets to interpret how it should be enforced or applied, and the courts must defer to that interpretation. So if I sue a federal agency or a federal agency sues one of my clients, the courts automatically defer to my opponent. Now that's absurd. That's absolutely a violation of due process. That's contrary to our entire concept of litigation, and it's flat wrong. And if there's nothing else that Justice Gorsuch does while he's there, it would be getting rid of the Chevron decision, because it is absolutely one of the worst decisions ever issued. So there is that issue. And then you've got, as I've indicated, the Congress absolutely abdicating their responsibility to oversee these agencies. So they commit what I would refer to as legislative malpractice. And that is, when they write legislation, they say, such as in Obamacare, we grant to the Secretary of Health and Human Services the authority to adopt whatever regulations are necessary to carry out the intent of this act. Well, for goodness sakes, I mean, it's obvious how we could end up in this situation when they write that type of legislation. All they've said is, hey, why don't you people that we know nothing about and we can't control and we can't fire and nobody can contact, and you're going to do whatever you want anyway for political reasons, how about if we just let you run all the laws in this country and you just write whatever you want, and then we'll make people comply with it. And if they don't, we're going to give you the power to fine them $37,500 a day. That ought to beat all of our citizens and all of the people throughout this country into submission. That's the way to go. But that's exactly what Congress has done.
That is absolutely insane. And the thing is that our Congress people really have abdicated all the power that they are supposed to have, and they're giving all of those agencies, including in those agencies all the NGOs and foundations that are putting all their so-called experts in there. And, boy, the American taxpayer is absolutely screwed under this system.
In every way possible, because it is just such a fundamental and foundational violation of due process. If you receive an enforcement letter from the EPA, what that letter will say is you have violated the Clean Water Act, and you are subject to penalties of $37,500 a day. You have 14 days to notify us if you are going to cooperate with us to address what you have done, to fix what you've done, and if you refuse to do it, we are going to sue you. What do you think every landowner does when they get that letter? They panic, they enter into a consent decree, and they do whatever the agencies want them to do. It truly is a totalitarian, despotic form of government. It is a horrible way to run a republic, if you will. But in addition to that, this is how we launder money. Keep that in mind. First of all, we should never have a 40% effective rate at the federal level. One of the most important aspects of what we need to do is real tax reform, and I'm not talking about changing the top rate from 40% to 35% or 38%. That's hogwash. Taxing authority ought to reside with the states. The federal government has a very limited role in what it ought to be doing in terms of our lives, our everyday lives. Taxing authority at the federal level probably shouldn't exceed 5 or 6%. Then the states are able to keep that money within their borders, and each state has its own distinct personality, concepts, that sort of thing. We were never intended that all of this power would reside in Washington, D.C. So what do? We're taxed by the IRS. We launder our money through Washington, D.C. A portion of it is taken by all of these various agencies, and then it's granted back to the state as though the federal government has the authority in the first place to do that. So what have we created? We've created a Department of Education at the federal level, which by all measure is an abject failure. It was created in the late 1970s. You tell me if our education system is improved or if it's worse. If it's worse, we ought to just get rid of the doggone thing. We create the EPA, created by executive order, not by Congress, a horrifically powerful agency that is not accountable to anybody, yet does not care about really looking at the environment. I would argue our DEQ does at the state level. I think at the state level, our DEQ is a pretty good agency. At the federal level, no. At the federal level, it is all about punishment. It's all about politicization. And so what do? We launder money through organizations such as the Sierra Club. These grants go to all of these various NGOs, as you refer to them. We have created what's called the Equal Access to Justice Act that allows these organizations to get massive amounts of money from these agencies in attorney's fees through sue and settle lawsuits. I mean, this entire system is so astoundingly corrupt that the fact that we have created it and we've allowed it to get to this point is really pretty tragic. I'm hoping we can reverse it. I'm hoping that through the regulatory reform of this president, we can move forward. But it's truly critical that we do it. Regulatory reform could be, would be, will be his absolute lasting legacy if he is successful in doing it. Because then all these things like this healthcare fiasco go away. You never give those agencies that power in the first place. All of these fiascos, the IRS, why give them the kind of power to destroy citizens? Why give these agencies the authority to go on someone's private property and say, you moved an irrigation ditch, we're going to destroy you.
Absolutely. And the thing that I think our listeners realize, but certainly a lot of people don't realize, is that they say, well, this, a little bit of socialized medicine would be a good thing because I couldn't afford the insurance otherwise. It costs you, on average, almost double for every procedure, everything that's done that the federal government has its fingers in, because they have that whole staff of bureaucrats and regulators that are siphoning off huge salaries, and that's all coming their money. So you're not only not saving anything, it's costing our country an enormous amount of money every single time a government agency takes over one more role that private industry should be taking care of.
For a lot of different reasons. I will tell you that the number one job, responsibility of a federal regulator is protecting their job. Okay? So
I agree with that, yeah.
If they get up every single day and their approach and their goal is to protect their job, everything that they do, all of the decisions they are going to make are going to be colored by that. So they're going to be risk averse, and they're going to make sure that whatever they do, they regulate, and they regulate hard. So again, I will use the term business model. We have created a business model that is fundamentally and constitutionally flawed because we have incentivized agencies to do everything in their power to increase costs, increase penalties, increase permitting fees, and increase the time it takes to get the permits that you need to do something. We have absolutely a fundamentally flawed system whereby we have the people who make the decisions that we have given the decision-making authority have every decision to make sure you never get what you need to do what you need to do to start that business, to continue that business, and that sort of thing. And I'll also say this. Obamacare started out with the idea that we had 30 million people who were uninsured, right? Isn't that how let's all remember back to 2009 and 2010, which the collective memory in Washington, D.C. is enough to send me over the edge because I think it only lasts about 27 minutes. Let's think about history here. Why was Obamacare put out there? What was the concept? What was the idea? What was the argument? We have 30 million
to take care of the under or uninsured.
But it was not about pre-existing conditions. It was not about birth control. It was not about free abortions.
Right.
It was not about all of those things. It was about providing insurance so that people would no longer go to the emergency room for their primary medical treatment, right? That was the point of this.
Yep.
All right. Do you think it would have cost trillions upon trillions of dollars to simply buy them insurance? Of course not. When the CBO first scored Obamacare, they had to get it under the $1 trillion mark. So they did through all kinds of shenanigans. And we knew, every one of us who paid a lick of sense, had a lick of sense, knew that was an absolute falsified number when it came under $1 trillion. Nobody's even looking at that number right now. I'll tell you what, take $800 a month in terms of insurance costs. Just do the math of $800 a month, which I don't think that's how much it would cost, probably $500 a month, but do the math. How much would it cost to have paid $500 a month to buy those 30,000 people insurance, or 30 million people insurance?
Sure. Bush did that when he gave everybody $800 to spend to try to re-energize the economy in the beginning of 2008.
Right. But what you have is just we have created this monstrosity called Obamacare that itself never accomplished what it was set out to do. So what has happened? They've moved the goalpost. And again, the collective memory in D.C. is such that nobody will talk about what the goalposts were or what the end game was. So you have this situation where we're fighting over pre-existing conditions, and we're going to kill all these people because they don't have insurance, and Republicans are evil, and what they're trying to do is the worst thing since anything ever existed in the history of the world. And nobody's willing to stand up and say, look, this is how this was sold. What you guys are not comparing any of either the House or Senate bill, they're not comparing the House or Senate bill to what Obamacare has done, what it actually, how it was actually implemented. They're comparing it to what the claims and promises were in 2009.
And they've fallen completely short.
We aren't even having a rational discussion, because they keep saying you can't take away Obamacare because of blah 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 blah. But Obamacare never did any of those things.
Right.
So they've created a straw man, and the Republicans are not good enough at messaging right now to say that was a straw man. That isn't what Obamacare did. But that's exactly how you see this expansion of regulatory authority. It could have been very simple. You could have done Obamacare in probably 3 pages. Okay, we pay for insurance for people who don't have it. Okay, done with that one. Move on to the next issue.
Yeah,
but what
absolutely.
have we done? The law itself was 2,500 pages. There are over 18, by the end of 2013 alone, there were over 18,000 pages of regulations to implement Obamacare. And the law itself was 2,500 pages long.
And on average, the insurance costs have gone up for those who are paying the tab on this thing by 28 to 30% per year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're breaking the states. We're breaking Medicaid. The irony of it all is that Medicaid was supposed to be for people who really were quite poor and not capable of providing for their medical care. And I have read numerous articles in the last 2 weeks describing the fact that the way that Obamacare was implemented, and the very foundation of it is that people who are able-bodied adults who can work are now taking the funding away from the people that Medicaid was actually intended for. And Medicaid isn't a good system anyway. I'm never going to advocate that Medicaid was a good system, because it was broke before this started. But now even its priorities under Obamacare have been so dramatically skewed towards a welfare state rather than a true needs state, that Medicaid itself is no longer of use to the people it was intended for in the first place. I mean, Obamacare has been an abject failure across the board, but in part it's because of that legislative malpractice that I talked about. If Congress is not capable of writing a statute that is self-implementing or self-effectuating when the whole dang thing is 2,500 pages, then all of them should be fired. We don't have to have regulations to carry statutes into effect. Statutes should say what they mean. If you want a statute that says you can't drive over 75 miles an hour, pass a statute that says you can't drive over 75 miles an hour. I don't need the Department of Transportation to adopt 7 pages of rules interpreting what that means.
Yeah, I agree. And not only we need to even look a little further back than that, because I'm a little older than you, but fact is I can remember before we had Medicare at all, and our medical costs in this country were extremely affordable for average Americans. You could have a baby for $500. Today, that same baby is going to cost you $20,000 or $25,000, and that is a result of our government taking over our medical system in our country.
Absolutely. The medical system, education. Look at some of these states that are failing their students so miserably. They're spending $16,000, $17,000, $18,000 per student. My goodness gracious. But the reality is, as most of my family members are educators, they will tell you we don't spend that per student. We spend that on the bureaucracy. We spend that on the consultants. We spend it on the studies. We spend it on people who are not working. We don't spend it on the students. And our educational system, truly, you draw the straight line. Draw a straight line from when Jimmy Carter created the Federal Department of Education to current day, and I do not think that you will see a point at time when you could describe our educational system as better than it was before that date.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely not. And I hope that Betsy DeVos actually does something with the Common Core curriculum. I think she's a little bit weak on that area, but the reality is we've got to get back to an education system that is world competitive, and we've been so far away from that for so long that we're losing our competitive advantage as a nation.
Well, and we have really, I think, part of what the problem has been with the bureaucratic takeover of education is that I think we've really even redefined what education is. I grew up outside of a very small town in Wyoming, and I grew up on a ranch, and I went to a high school with 125 students. My class was, I think, the largest that ever graduated from there, and there were 36 of us. Most of them are around 24, 25, 27 kids in a class. And I had a very classically basic education. European literature, my math classes all the way up to calculus and trigonometry, and history and science, biology, geometry, those kinds of things. I didn't have a lot of other classes because we didn't have enough students for them. I didn't have speech. I didn't have debate. I didn't have all of the various classes that you can take now, but I received a classically good education in 1981. I don't think that we are teaching a classically good education anymore. I think we are focusing on so many things that are not education but are indoctrination. But again, that's a bureaucratization of the process itself. Let teachers teach. Don't be dictating all of these things. You can see what's coming out of the universities. But again, I think that this goes back to the fact that we have a federal government that is dictating things that it shouldn't be involved in. The idea that we would have a federal government dictating what bathrooms people could use is so far removed from the from the concept of reasonableness that it's bizarre to me that we're even having the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot imagine that a Department of Education at the federal level would send out a Dear Colleague letter saying you must let boys in girls' showers and girls in boys' showers and talk about identity politics. I mean, when you think about really the concept of those kinds of things, what you realize is it has nothing to do with education and is much more of an insidious view, not of the world, but of the concept of what government is.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It's a Marxist form of government that we will say what is.
That's right.
It's the 1984 George Orwell type of the use of language so that you can indoctrinate people because nothing is right and wrong, nothing's black, nothing's white, nothing's yellow, nothing's green. We as a government get to define and dictate what education is and who's a girl and who's a boy because we as the federal government have that power. Why would we have ever given an agency the authority to make those kinds of determinations and then attempt to impose them again on citizens of a republic?
Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't fit. It absolutely does not fit the definition of a republic. It does, however, as you say, fit the definition of a Marxist democracy.
It is the idea that the government, I've just always felt that the more vicious almost that the government can be against you, and if you take it, it just gives the power becomes exponential. You're giving them more and more power on an exponential basis because if you don't fight back with some of these most bizarre things that every one of us know are wrong and bizarre and make no sense, then they just keep taking and usurping more and more of not only of the state's authority, but our own individual autonomy. The federal government really doesn't get to dictate to me how I view certain things, yet that is where we are, and a lot of it comes from this overregulation and this power of these agencies and the authority that has been, or that has not been granted to them. This authority was never granted to them. This is authority that has been sucked by the executive branch away from the legislative branch and away from the judicial branch and away from the states. This is power that has been unlawfully and wrongfully and unreasonably and unconstitutionally stolen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And since you brought up George Orwell in 1984, one of the classic quotes from Orwell is, if you want to see what the future has in store, think of a human face with a boot on it permanently. And that really is exactly what's happening in our country. I mean, the sort of regulatory takings that have happened in this country have stripped away all the rights that were unalienable rights under our Constitution.
Well, and some of the things that I have talked about in my speech is I describe the manner in which, or what I would describe as the total and complete disdain by which many of these agencies view, again, the citizens of this country. And I keep using that terminology because I think it is significant and important that we remind ourselves that we are citizens under the Constitution and have certain inalienable rights that these agencies cannot take away because they do not come from government, they come from God. And when you look at really one of the foundational principles of our form of government, when our forefathers came up with that, that was one of the most unique concepts probably in the history of the world. With the idea that if the government does not grant you your rights, they don't have the ability to take them away. Our rights come from God, meaning the government can never take them away. And what we have seen with this dramatic change over the last 70 years in terms of this overreach is that the people in D.C. that keep usurping this power and dragging it away from us and stealing it from us individually have an enormous amount of disdain and dislike for us and think that we're all so incapable of taking care of ourselves, ignoring the fact that we're the ones that pay their salaries. But here's an example. The federal workers' safety laws include some 4,000 rules dictating precisely what equipment shall be used and how facilities are built, including they have a requirement that stairways shall be lit by natural or artificial illumination. And you ask yourself, okay, what other options do we have? And the reason I use that as an example is because these people truly believe they have to tell builders that you are required by law to put lighting in your stairwells. Now, that's ridiculous that they think that they're the ones that have to tell the builders that. But I think that it is really, truly an insight into their mindset that they think that we are so stupid. We're not capable of recognizing when we walk into that dark stairwell we may need some light.
Well, Harriet, one of the things, too, that's also interesting about the federal agencies is that when they lose in court, then those same stupid taxpayers have to foot the bill because they are never accountable to pay any of those bills themselves.
No, they aren't. There is no personal liability. There's no personal responsibility. And that is one of the things that I have found in doing litigation as long as I have, is that when someone in the EPA makes a bad decision and sues my client up in Worland, Wyoming for violating the Clean Water Act, they lost that lawsuit, and they lost it bad. And we did a 2-week trial. The jury was out for 2.5 hours and came back on our side on every single issue. There were no repercussions to those people whatsoever. The people who made the decision to bring the suit, the people who brought the enforcement action, the attorneys, there were no negative consequences to anybody involved. They shrug their shoulders and they walk away. There are no consequences to really bad decisions. And there are no consequences to the kind of destructive force that they bring to bear. Some of these regulations have destroyed our industries. Absolutely destroyed our industries. Look at the coal industry, Peabody, Arch Coal, all of these, they've gone bankrupt. And they've gone bankrupt not because Congress made a policy decision about the use of coal, not because Congress, our representatives, decided that we needed to go solely to renewables and that we were going to not mine for coal in this country anymore, but because somebody in Washington, D.C., who works with a bunch of radical environmentalists, not only here but in the UN and throughout the world, decided to destroy the coal industry.
Right.
it was someone who has no accountability for that action whatsoever and continues to pull in $180,000 a year plus benefits plus retirement, despite the fact that they broke some of the most profitable and important industries in our country.
Mm-hmm. And doing the same thing with mining, with logging, with all of our natural resource industries.
Well, and that's something else. You know, we've talked a lot about the economic impact of this, but the reality is that it's the Forest Service that is the agency and the entity that is to blame for what has happened to the national forests, predominantly in the western United States, because that is where the vast majority of our national forest lands are. The National Forest Service lands were created. The National Forest Service was created by the 1896 Organic Act, and it was the Forest Service was placed within the Department of Ag, not the Department of Interior. Mm-hmm. And it was 192 million acres that was designed for a continuous supply of timber and a continuous supply of water. Now over 50% of the National Forest Service lands are off limits to development and production, and they treat them like they're national parks, but they were never intended to be. So what ended up happening, because of a blowdown in the Route National Forest in 1997, then the Forest Service refused to go in and clean up that area. That's ground zero for the pine beetle outbreak. So you know what's happened in Montana. I know what's happened in Wyoming. We know what's happened in Colorado and Idaho and throughout the Rocky Mountain region. And that's the National Forest Service. And I know that for a fact because I have the GAO reports proving it. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And now we're seeing this latest little intrusion by the UN saying that they need to they're urging the federal government to take over water resource and allocations from individuals and from the states. Part of the reasoning behind that, and I read the article about it, was that the forests are being and the watersheds are being improperly used, but they don't say it's improperly used because the federal government and all the regulators are making it all off limits so that you can't go in and cut timber and try to clean up and make the forest more healthy. They're saying that it's we need to control every aspect now of our natural resources, and the government is the reason that we've got the problem in the first place.
Absolutely. All you have to do is look at the Gold King mine disaster. That was the EPA that did that, and had that been an individual that did what the EPA did, they'd be sitting in prison right now.
Absolutely.
They would have been destroyed, and they would be sitting in prison right now. If the concept and the idea of the federal government taking over water resources is absolutely, it would be almost criminal because of what they have done with our natural resources. Our forests, our national forests, have been absolutely devastated because of the mismanagement of the National Forest Service. And I'm going to say this, I think that a lot of the National Forest Service employees on the ground actually have a real interest in protecting that resource, but because of the rules and regulations coming out of Washington, D.C., they're not even capable of managing it. And again, I'll come back to the roadless rule, which is one of the very last things that Clinton did on his way out the door in 2001. Bush was elected in 2000, and in January of 2001, the roadless rule went into effect, and it denies management, access, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands. That's where we've had our catastrophic forest fires. It's where we've had these issues with the pine beetle outbreak, all of those things. And when they were doing, when the rulemaking for the roadless rule was being considered, in fact, the Forest Service employees submitted extensive comments saying, "Oh, for God's sakes, please don't do this. Please don't do this. Please don't do this. You are going. If you adopt this rule, you will make it impossible for us to manage these resources and protect the ecological values." That's their terminology, the ecological value of the National Forest Service lands. So again, that's where I first got my interest in this, because I was actively involved in that roadless lawsuit. And when I realized that the local Forest Service employees were saying, "Please, for God's sakes, don't do this," and then and then listening to the arguments made by the U.S. attorney, who argued that they recognized that there would be ecological disasters in certain areas, but it was more important to have a one-size-fits-all rule coming out of Washington, D.C. you just realize that the federal government, their management is really very poor. And I was just recently talking to somebody the other day, and I said, why don't you, and they're a real strong advocate for a strong federal government. And I said, all right, we can discuss this. I said, why don't you tell me one thing that the federal government does well?
I bet that brought a pregnant pause.
Longer than the one that we just had. And they finally said defense. And I said, and you know what? That's one of the things the federal government is supposed to be doing. I agree with you on that. I said, what else does the federal government do well? At VA, has the VA system been run well? Well, and you get that. And I said, tell me about, our National Forest Service. You think that our Forest Service lands have got an $11 billion road backlog right now. We've lost 50 million acres in just the last 10 years or so in terms of the catastrophic forest fires. I said, tell me what they do well. And
Harriet, not to interrupt you, but they're blaming that on climate change. And everybody that understands our national forests knows that the biggest reason we're having these problems are because of insect devastation and the fact that we've not been able to go in and do any logging to try to manage our forests.
And I agree with that, and I actually think that this catch-all of global warming and climate change has been created, again, out of the bowels of the bureaucratic byways in Washington, D.C. It's just another mechanism by which to control us and allow them to expand and expand and expand their power. It is a very Marxist concept. It's a socialist movement. I mean, we all have to recognize that the idea of government controlling every aspect of our lives is truly the end goal for many of these people. But before we're done, there's one thing I want to talk about, and that we need to be forcing Congress to adopt what we refer to as the Regulation Freedom Amendment. And I'm going to read it to you, and it is that whenever 1/4 of the members of the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate transmit to the President their written declaration of opposition to a proposed federal regulation, it shall require a majority vote of the House and Senate to adopt that regulation. If we were to adopt that, whether legislatively or constitutionally, I can tell you something, we would shut this down like that. We can stop this. I'm very optimistic that people are learning about this, willing to listen, and willing to fight these issues. We can fight this, Dan. And there are a lot of people out there who are really focusing on this right now, and we have got to force Congress to act to adopt that as a constitutional amendment, if not a statute. Let's pull the power back to the people through our representatives, make them accountable to us. If we do that, we change the trajectory of this country and we get it back on track as being a freedom-loving, a liberty-believing, that we carry out the concept of what truly our forefathers sought, which was that the power should be with the individual and that we are autonomous from the government and that the government should not control our lives. Our rights come from God, not from the government.
I agree. Well, Harriet, I hate to say this, but we've run out of time. But I will ask, obviously we've got at least another hour's worth of talking about this to do. Would you be willing to come back on and continue this conversation in a few weeks?
You bet. If that's what people want, perhaps.
Well, no, there's so much to it. I mean, the bottom line is that there's so much to all the regulation that we just barely scratched the surface. We could probably talk on this every week for the rest of the year and still not do justice. So, but I will, if you would be willing to come on in a few weeks, we'll schedule another radio show and bring you back on, and we will continue to connect the dots for our listeners. So with that said, Kelby, I'm turning the radio show over to you, and Harriet, thank you again for your time on this, and all I can say is that our listeners need to realize what an incredibly bright lady we have on our radio show, and go to our website and you'll get more information on Harriet, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots. with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific.